Hi, it's Chris with Implied Music. Melody. Today I want to talk about melody, and I don't think this is the last time or the first time that I'll talk about it, right? We'll discuss scales. We'll talk about the syntax of melody, the structure, the sentence structure almost of how a good melody works, how melodic tones work with chords. All these things come into play, but there is a certain ineffable quality as well, something that taps into our intuition, into our expectation, into our sense of storytelling. Melody is a really powerful component of music. I've got 6 short examples. Let's dive in. Well, just a little housekeeping. First of all, if this is the second or third video of mine you've seen and you're getting something out of the channel, you're finding something in this material, in this, what is, I guess, essentially music theory, although it's not academic, in this music theory for yourself, for your own music, something that you can use right away, and you're not subscribed to the channel, now's the time to hit that subscribe button. I'm also very interested in your comments, what you have to say about your own music and what we're teaching, and maybe what you'd like to see. It's very revealing, some of the questions that I get here about kind of how well I'm connecting and where maybe we should be going next. And to some degree, talking about melody is a result of the sort of interactions that I've seen between community members here on the channel and questions that I get myself. And I have to say that there probably are better people than me to talk about melody. As a pianist, as a young pianist, I got very up into chords. Chords. But melody is crucial. And since I've got a couple of friends who are all about melody, they've kind of changed my mind a little bit. Let's go over to the screen. Here's a C triad, and it's got 3 important notes in it, C, E, and G. And if I play the C triad down here, I can play a melody. Now, some of those melodic tones are in the chord, E and C and G. Some of those melodic tones are not. When you're making your melody, you're going to really make a distinction between chord tones and non-chord tones. And there are a couple of distinctions to make, and we'll look at them in the examples. But there's one more thing before we dive into what we're going to be sort of analyzing that I want to put out there right away. We've talked about scales, we've talked about chords, but I just want to keep this fresh in your mind. And it's this. In the C major scale, there's a very important note. It's called the leading tone. It's the 7th step of the scale, and it's a half step away from C, a half step below. That half step, that push, is a huge part of what makes melody work. It's not always on the 7th degree of the scale. But that half step is creating a kind of a push that's absolutely essential. Let's look at our first example. It has a beautiful kind of use of that idea. Super simple progression to begin. C, G, F, and G7. Now, the melodic tones on the top, sixths. And my teacher used to joke and say, all sixths are good. This leap of a sixth is a leap with 2 notes from the chord. And when I go to the G chord, it's, also 2 notes from the chord. Here I went from the 3rd up to the root. Here I went from the 5th up to the 3rd. When I go to the F chord, I go from the 5th up to the 3rd again, and then resolving to D. So I'm going to embellish that leap of a 6th with a chromatic tone or two to launch the melody. The use of that chromatic tone, really outside the chord and outside the scale, creates a push, doesn't it? It creates a kind of a tension and then a release. Now, melodies tell stories. In order to make a melody engaging, you have to have a sort of a character, a specific interval, or a quality of being within the chord. For instance, that leap of a 6th is my hero in the melody. But I want to put that hero in a little bit of danger because it's a story. What's going to happen? Oh, they made it. It's crazy, right? It's like a little TV show within a second or two. And that sense of peril, that sense of engagement with the push and pull of expectation and fulfillment is what makes a good melody. Good melodies have a variety of intervals. They have wide intervals and they have narrow intervals. They have different rhythms as well. A good melody has variety, and that variety tells a story. Let's look at our second example. The next example works off a chord progression as well, a little more dense voicings, but it's going to use one of my favorite tricks, which is integrating a kind of a perseverating melodic figure that lives not on necessarily a chord tone or one of the important scale tones, but on the 9th. We can use other things too, like the 7th or the 6th. I picked the 9th here. Let's look at our chord progression. First thing is B flat major 9, C7, F major 7, D minor 7. And I don't know if the computer said that correctly to us. Yeah, pretty close. So once we get to the melody, you can actually see the melody has what looks like a repeated architecture. You see how it steps down and then does its little leap up? Again, I'm mixing wider intervals with narrower intervals. And since I know I'm in the key of F, I want to look at what my teacher used to call the melodic axis. And I'm going to point out to you that G. I'm thinking about that G. And of course, the F is important too. But I'm thinking about that G as an axis, a central tone around which the melodic figure travels. The G and the F play differently with different chords from the progression. And here I just live on the G, right? There's something melancholy and bittersweet about using a non-chord tone in a melody. And now I resolve to F, but the melodic tone stays on G. It's a beautiful sound, and a sound that we hear a lot in contemporary pop music. Don't be unreasonably attached to chord tones or resolving like in Three Blind Mice to your home note, to your first note of the scale. Let's go on. So we know that scales are super important in making a good melody, and sometimes just a great scale will get you 80% of the way. This scale is one of my favorites, and you can see it on the screen. And one of the things about it, you notice right away maybe, is it has a couple of narrow leaps, thirds in it. This scale, starting on D, is called the double harmonic major. It has a kind of a minor quality because of the flat 2 and the flat 6. And it's got some unusual chords in it. In fact, it's got a kind of a weird 5 chord. You know, that flat 5 sound there, which is pretty cool sounding. and it's got a minor 4 chord. So there's something great about that, but I haven't used any chords. I've just got a little, sort of pumping fifth in the bass. So listen to that scale again. There it is. And when you're using a scale which has a unusual sound, emphasize the notes that are different from the conventional, say, major scale or minor scale that you might be used to. In this case, the flat 2, the flat 6. And this is a really cinematic scale. It's evocative of North Indian music or music from Asia or the Middle East. Sort of in a conventional way, I'll say that. And of course, not accurately, because we're, listening to it on the piano and in the tuning system that's pretty European. Nevertheless, that scale is fascinating. I mean, not the least about it is there's my D, and I've got this little enclosure around my home note D that's just very sexy. Let's go on. So the next example has a G center, and we're going to use the ninth, the A. And we're going to end on an A major chord here, right? This is pushing us to D and then D7. And again, back to that A, the ninth of the G chord. And since the progression needs to change and go to C, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to use the D, the ninth of the C chord. And this is just kind of an interlude, and then wrap it up. And I think this melody, and we'll listen to it again, has an unusual and melancholically satisfying, so to speak, sentence structure, because it begins with a very logical sentence. It sounds like a statement, doesn't it? And then there's a kind of an answer to that statement. A heightened answer, that leap of a sixth, right? It raises the stakes. And once those stakes are raised, we take them to a slightly different place. But it's not a strong conclusion. It has a kind of a resting propulsion. And then we go back to the initial theme, but with an air of resignation, I guess is what I would say. Melodies have stories, and those stories are the result of, I guess I would just say, syntax, almost like a paragraph, right? The classic one, I'm sure you're aware, is what we call antiphony, where there's a call and response. Or perhaps you might think of it as question and answer. This one doesn't really say question and answer as much as it says statement, elevated statement, rethought, idea, resignation. All those things are really important, though. It's interesting to me. I love it. It's almost like philosophy. There's a kind of a logic to it. More than anything else, melody exhibits logic, right? A good melody is logical. It's architectural. It's structural. Well, you don't have to have a complicated scale that maybe you've never heard before to write a satisfying melody. In fact, the major pentatonic scale here in F major pentatonic, only 5 notes, can become the backbone of a strong melody. And here's a real question and answer melody. You can hear that architecture. And now a kind of a B statement to that question and answer. that's propulsive. We're not home yet. And then almost like a real finer final answer. Songs like Amazing Grace have stability and enduring power because of the strength of the major pentatonic scale. In the next example, it's really just kind of a little jam melody, right? So I've decided to use the E minor pentatonic scale and a simple chord progression, E minor, D, C, back to D. And this sound is classic, right? Just kind of jamming around the scale if I was a guitarist. And again, really just walking step by step along the scale, maybe some figuration. And, you know, I did that improvisationally. I can't say that I really composed that sort of solo. But if you look at it, there's an architectural pattern to it, which should be sort of familiar from what we've been discussing all along. We begin high and we do this peak and valley thing. There's a high point here, a high point in the middle, and a high point at the end. Good solos will exhibit the same musical sentence structure that we find in good melodies. Along the way, you may touch many more non-chord tones and embellish your melody a lot more than you would if you were just trying to write something that a singer could handle. But what the heck, right? Good melodies have architecture. They use chord tones and non-chord tones. They use rhythmic variety, intervallic variety. They exhibit a kind of a sentence structure. It's almost like a good melody is a good paragraph, or maybe like a little story. The motif, the basic essential element of the melody, is our sort of main character. And then we just send them on their way and ask them to negotiate the terrain of the chord progression or scale system that we're in. We flip things around a little bit. We'll put them in a different costume. What would you be like if you lived on the 9th of this chord? Hey, motif, what would you be like if you lived on the 5th? Melodies are our heroes in our songs, right? I'm still learning about all this stuff. I recognize that the way my brain works, I'm kind of more of a chord person, but I'll tell you, if you get it to the heart of what makes chords work, you'll discover that it's kind of about melodic motion. This is something that the Baroque and polyphonic composers, my favorite composer, Bach, knew deep down, and something that I'm really trying to integrate for myself as a composer and just player and musical thinker. Start thinking about melody all the time. That's my plan. I hope this has been useful. Well, I asked you at the beginning, and I'll just remind you, subscribe to the channel, like this video, leave us a comment. We want to know what's going on. You know, I want to know what's going on. And I'll see you next time.